In 1939, Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland triggered the start of World War II, a catastrophic global conflict that engulfed much of Europe, the Pacific and beyond, lasting until 1945. The war was fought between two major alliances: the Allied powers, which included Britain, France, the Soviet Union, the United States, China, and numerous other nations, and the Axis powers, primarily led by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. What began as a regional dispute in Europe quickly escalated into a worldwide struggle involving nearly every continent, resulting in unprecedented destruction and loss of life. The war's impact was far-reaching, with its effects felt across military, political, and civilian spheres. Brutal land, sea, and air battles ravaged cities and nations, while civilians endured bombings, occupation, and severe shortages. The conflict saw the rise of technological warfare, with innovations in aircraft, tanks, and weaponry transforming combat, alongside tragic events like the Holocaust, which saw the systematic extermination of millions. As the tide of war shifted in favor of the Allies, the Axis powers faced devastating defeats on multiple fronts, leading to the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany in Europe in May 1945, followed by Japan's surrender in the Pacific in September of the same year. By the end of World War II, the death toll was staggering. Approximately 20 million soldiers and an estimated 40 million civilians had lost their lives, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The war's conclusion reshaped global geopolitics, setting the stage for the Cold War and the reorganization of international relations through institutions such as the United Nations. Below is a timeline highlighting some of the war's most significant and decisive battles that shaped its course. Battle of the Atlantic, September 3, 1939. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and one of the most crucial campaigns of World War II, lasting the entire duration of the conflict. It began just days after the war was declared, as the Allies sought to impose a naval blockade on Germany to cut off essential supplies, including food, fuel, and war materials. This sparked a prolonged and fierce struggle for control of the Atlantic's vital shipping routes, which would determine whether Britain and the Allied forces could maintain their supply lines and resist the Axis onslaught. Germany, relying heavily on its fleet of U-boats, submarines, launched a counter-blockade against Allied shipping, attempting to strangle the British war effort by sinking merchant ships and cutting off critical supplies. At the outset, the U-boats were highly effective, operating in wolf packs to target Allied convoys and creating a sense of terror on the open seas. Merchant ships and military vessels alike were torpedoed, and the losses mounted quickly. By 1941, the situation was dire for the Allies, with thousands of ships sunk and their ability to sustain the war effort severely threatened. However, the tide of the battle began to turn as the Allies adapted. They introduced new strategies, such as organizing merchant ships into convoys escorted by warships, increasing air patrols with long-range bombers and reconnaissance planes, and developing technological innovations like sonar and radar to detect and neutralize U-boats. The introduction of hedgehog depth charges and the breaking of Germany's Enigma code by Allied cryptographers were also pivotal in countering the U-boat threat. These advancements significantly reduced the effectiveness of German submarine operations and allowed the Allies to reclaim the advantage in the Atlantic. Over the course of the 5-year campaign, thousands of ships, both military and civilian, were engaged in more than 100 significant battles across the Atlantic. Despite the eventual Allied success, the cost was enormous, with around 100,000 lives lost, including sailors, merchant mariners, and civilians. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a fight for control of the seas, but a strategic lifeline for the Allied war effort, ensuring the flow of essential supplies, troops, and equipment between North America, Britain, and beyond. Its outcome played a critical role in determining the course of the war, and the Allied victory in the Atlantic was a major factor in the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. Battle of Dunkirk, May 26, 1940. During the German invasion near the French coastal town of Dunkirk in May 1940, German forces executed a swift and devastating blitzkrieg offensive that rapidly swept through Belgium and northern France. This relentless advance severed communication and transport lines between the French and British armies, leaving tens of thousands of Allied troops trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk with their backs to the sea. As the German forces closed in, the situation seemed hopeless for the stranded soldiers who faced the grim reality of either capture or annihilation. However, in a surprising turn of events, Adolf Hitler unexpectedly ordered the German advance to halt, giving the Allies a brief but critical window of opportunity to launch a daring evacuation effort. That evacuation, known as Operation Dynamo, was a remarkable and unprecedented feat of coordination and bravery. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, British and French forces, aided by a makeshift flotilla of over 800 vessels, including naval ships, fishing boats, and civilian yachts, worked tirelessly to rescue as many soldiers as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk. The operation was fraught with peril as German aircraft bombed the evacuation routes and strafed the soldiers waiting on the shore. Despite these challenges, the Allies managed to evacuate over 338,000 troops from Dunkirk, far surpassing initial expectations. This extraordinary rescue, often referred to as the Miracle of Dunkirk, became a turning point in the early stages of the war. Although Germany ultimately claimed victory, with the remaining Allied forces surrendering and much of France soon falling under German occupation, the successful evacuation of so many troops was a significant morale boost for Britain. The Dunkirk spirit became a symbol of resilience, determination, and unity in the face of overwhelming odds. The rescue effort demonstrated not only the bravery of the soldiers, but also the willingness of ordinary citizens to risk their lives to aid their countrymen. The emotional impact of Operation Dynamo helped to galvanize the British public and government, reinforcing their resolve to continue fighting the war despite the looming threat of invasion. The event remains one of the most iconic episodes of World War II, celebrated as an example of courage and perseverance under extreme adversity. Battle of Britain, July 10, 1940. Over the course of nearly 4 months from July to October 1940, Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, and Navy mounted a fierce defense against relentless bombing raids from Germany's Luftwaffe. The goal of the German Air Force was to destroy the RAF in preparation for a full-scale invasion of Britain. Initially, the Luftwaffe focused on bombing military targets, including airfields and radar stations. However, as the battle progressed, the campaign escalated into what became known as the Blitz, with Germany shifting its focus to bombing major cities like London in an attempt to break British morale. Despite the intense airstrikes, Britain's effective use of radar technology and the resilience of the RAF proved decisive. Radar allowed the British to detect incoming German aircraft early, providing a crucial advantage in the air battles. Furthermore, Adolf Hitler's strategic error in targeting civilian areas instead of military bases gave the RAF the chance to regroup and recover from earlier losses. By October, the RAF had successfully defended Britain, securing victory in the Battle of Britain and preventing a German invasion. The campaign became a symbol of British resilience and determination, remembered as a key turning point in the war. Battle of Crete, May 20th, 1941. The Battle of Crete marked a significant and historic moment in World War II as Nazi Germany launched the first large-scale airborne invasion in military history. German paratroopers, or Fallschirmjäger, descended on the Greek island of Crete, hoping to seize control of this strategically important location. Although the invasion was initially met with fierce resistance from Allied forces, including British, Greek, Australian and New Zealand troops who had been stationed on the island, the Germans faced heavy losses on the first day, particularly during their landings. Despite their early setbacks, the Germans eventually gained the upper hand due to Allied fears of a larger amphibious assault and a breakdown in communication among Allied commanders. Over the course of the battle, nearly 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed, and over 3,000 Germans lost their lives. Although Germany ultimately succeeded in capturing Crete, Adolf Hitler, shocked by the high number of paratrooper casualties, famously declared that the day of the parachutist is over. As a result, the Battle of Crete was the last major airborne operation conducted by Germany during the war, even as Allied forces learned valuable lessons in airborne tactics from the battle. The Siege of Leningrad, September 8, 1941. The Siege of Leningrad was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history, lasting nearly 900 days. German and Finnish forces encircled the Soviet city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Cutting off all supply routes and isolating the electricity and transportation severed, the city's residents faced unimaginable hardships. Battle of Moscow, October 2, 1941. The Battle of Moscow was a crucial confrontation in the Eastern Front of World War II, as German forces launched a direct assault on the Soviet capital after months of rapid advances during Operation Barbarossa. The Germans sought to capture Moscow before the onset of winter, believing that the fall of the Soviet capital would lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the Germans approached the city, the Soviet leadership fortified Moscow, brought in reinforcements from Siberia, and organized a determined defense. Both sides suffered significant casualties as they battled not only each other, but also the onset of the harsh Russian winter. The freezing temperatures and poor logistical planning slowed the German advance, and the Soviets were able to mount a counter-offensive that pushed the Germans back. By early January 1942, the Germans had been forced to retreat, marking a major setback for the Axis powers. The successful defense of Moscow boosted Soviet morale and marked the beginning of the long Soviet pushback against German forces. Battle of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese military launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, located on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. The attack was intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and prevent American interference in Japan's planned expansion throughout the Pacific. The Japanese struck early in the morning, launching a series of devastating air raids that destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships and over 300 aircraft. The attack killed approximately 2,400 Americans, including both military personnel and civilians, and left another 1,000 wounded. While Japan achieved a tactical victory, the attack galvanized the United States, prompting President Franklin D. Roosevelt to famously declare December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan, formally entering World War II and shifting the balance of power in the conflict. Second Battle of Kharkov, May 12, 1942. The Second Battle of Kharkov was a major confrontation on the Eastern Front between the Soviet Red Army and the German Wehrmacht. Following the successful defense of Moscow, the Soviets sought to launch a counter-offensive in the spring of 1942, focusing on the Ukrainian city of Kharkov. The Red Army, bolstered by over 1,500 tanks and 1,000 aircraft, attacked the German positions in an attempt to liberate the city. However, German intelligence intercepted Soviet plans and prepared a counterstrike. The battle quickly turned against the Soviets, and after suffering nearly 300,000 casualties and losing significant amounts of equipment, they were forced to withdraw. The Second Battle of Kharkov was a devastating defeat for the Soviets, and it reinforced Germany's dominance on the Eastern Front at that stage of the war. Battle of Midway, June 4, 1942. The Battle of Midway is considered one of the most significant naval victories for the United States during World War II and a major turning point in the Pacific theater. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military sought to expand its control over the Pacific by targeting Midway Atoll, a strategic US base. However, US naval intelligence successfully broke Japanese codes and learned of the planned attack in advance. Using this information, US forces prepared a trap for the Japanese fleet. In a decisive battle, US dive bombers and torpedo planes sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's naval power. The loss of the carriers, along with hundreds of experienced pilots, weakened Japan's ability to wage offensive operations in the Pacific. The victory at Midway shifted the momentum of the war in favor of the Allies and marked the beginning of a long series of US advances across the Pacific. Battle of the Guadalcanal Campaign, August 7, 1942. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a brutal 6-month campaign fought between Allied forces, primarily the United States, and Japan over control of the strategically important island of Guadalcanal in the South Pacific. The campaign began when US Marines launched a surprise attack and captured an airfield under construction by Japanese forces. The capture of the airfield was a critical objective, as it would allow the Allies to project power in the Pacific and disrupt Japanese supply lines. However, the Japanese quickly regrouped and launched counterattacks, leading to intense hand-to-hand jungle combat. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, with the Japanese losing 31,000 soldiers and 38 ships, while the Allies lost 7,100 soldiers and 29 ships. After months of fighting, the Japanese were eventually forced to abandon the island, marking a significant victory for the Allies and a turning point in the Pacific War. Battle of Stalingrad, August 23, 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the largest and deadliest battles of World War II, as well as a crucial turning point in the war. The battle began when German forces launched an offensive to capture the city of Stalingrad, a key industrial hub on the Volga River. The Red Army, determined to defend the city at all costs, mounted a fierce resistance, and the fighting soon devolved into brutal urban warfare. Both sides suffered staggering casualties as they fought for control of the city, often battling block by block and building by building. As winter set in, the Soviet forces launched a counter-offensive, encircling the German Sixth Army and cutting off their supply lines. Trapped and starving, the German forces were eventually forced to surrender. The battle resulted in nearly 2 million casualties, including civilians, and marked the first major defeat for Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and was a turning point in the war as the Axis powers began to lose momentum. Operation Torch, November 8, 1942. Operation Torch was the first major Allied invasion of World War II in the North African theater, aimed at securing control of the Mediterranean and diverting Axis forces from the Eastern Front. The operation was led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and involved amphibious landings at 3 key locations: Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca, which were under Vichy French control. After fierce fighting, The Allies were able to secure the region and force the Vichy French forces to switch allegiance to the Allied cause. The success of Operation Torch paved the way for the Allied advance into Tunisia and the eventual defeat of German and Italian forces in North Africa. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously described the victory as the end of the beginning, signaling a turning point in the war as the Allies gained momentum in their fight against the Axis powers. Battle of Kursk, July 5th to August 23rd, 1943. The Battle of Kursk is widely regarded as the largest tank battle in military history and one of the most decisive engagements on the Eastern Front during World War II. Fought between the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army near Kursk, Russia, this battle involved an estimated 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and over 2 million soldiers. After suffering significant defeats at Stalingrad, Germany launched its last major blitzkrieg offensive, Operation Citadel, in a desperate attempt to regain momentum and secure victory on the Eastern Front. However, due to delays in the German attack and the cracking of the Wehrmacht's code by Soviet intelligence, the Red Army was well prepared for the assault. Soviet forces constructed massive defensive lines around Kursk and deployed deep layers of artillery, mines, and anti-tank defenses. Over several weeks of brutal fighting, the Soviets successfully repelled the German advance, inflicted heavy losses, and launched counteroffensives that forced the Germans into a retreat. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of German offensive operations in the east and solidified Soviet dominance for the remainder of the war. This victory was a crucial turning point that helped prevent Hitler from conquering Russia. Battle of Monte Cassino, January 17th, 1944. The Battle of Monte Cassino was a series of 4 ferocious assaults by the Allies to break through the German Gustav Line and advance toward Rome. The town of Monte Cassino was strategically located atop a steep hill, home to the historic Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, founded in 524 AD. The abbey, positioned on high ground, provided the Germans with a strong defensive position, but both sides assured the Vatican that it would not be attacked or used for military purposes. Despite these assurances, the Allies suspected that German forces were using the abbey to observe troop movements, and on February 15, 1944, they launched a massive bombing raid that reduced the ancient abbey to rubble. The destruction of the abbey led to public outcry, and ironically, after the bombing, German paratroopers used the ruins as a fortified position to shelter from further attacks. The battle dragged on for months, with Allied forces suffering heavy casualties as they attempted to dislodge the Germans. It wasn't until May 18, 1944, that Polish troops finally captured the abbey, leading the way for the Allied liberation of Rome shortly afterward. The battle is remembered for its immense cost in human life and the controversial destruction of one of Christianity's oldest monasteries. Battle of Anzio, January 22nd to June 5th, 1944. The Battle of Anzio was part of the Allied campaign to liberate Italy and advance toward Rome. In an attempt to outflank the German defenses along the Gustav Line, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious assault at Anzio, a coastal town located 30 miles south of Rome. The landing initially caught the Germans by surprise, and the Allies quickly secured a beachhead. However, rather than advancing rapidly, the Allies hesitated, allowing the Germans time to regroup and launch fierce counterattacks. What was initially intended to be a quick breakthrough turned into a brutal months-long stalemate as both sides dug in. The Germans encircled the beachhead, and the Allies faced heavy bombardment and repeated assaults, leading to significant casualties. The fighting at Anzio did succeed in diverting German troops away from France in the lead-up to the D-Day invasion, but the prolonged nature of the battle and high losses led many to see it as a failure. It wasn't until June 5, 1944, one day before the Normandy landings, that the Allies finally broke through the German defenses and captured Rome. Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19–20, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was one of the largest aircraft carrier battles in history and a crucial victory for the United States in the Pacific theater. As Allied forces advanced toward the Marianas Islands, Japan launched a large-scale naval counterattack in a last-ditch effort to halt the Allied advance. The battle pitted the U.S. Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, against the Japanese combined fleet. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, allowing U.S. forces to anticipate the attack. When the battle began, the U.S. launched a preemptive strike, destroying much of Japan's carrier-based air power. The battle became infamous for the lopsided nature of the American victory, as U.S. pilots referred to it as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the massive losses suffered by the Japanese. The United States lost only a few dozen planes, while Japan lost over 600 aircraft, 2 oilers, and 3 aircraft carriers. The battle severely weakened Japan's ability to conduct further offensive operations and gave the Allies uncontested control of the Pacific. Battle of Normandy, June 6th to August 30th, 1944. The Battle of Normandy, which began with the famous D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, was a decisive Allied campaign that paved the way for the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation. On D-Day, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed 5 beaches along the coast of Normandy, France, in what was one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. The landings were preceded by a massive airborne assault, with paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines to secure key positions. The fighting on the beaches, particularly at Omaha Beach, was intense, with over 2,000 American casualties and around 4,000 deaths on the first day alone. Despite the heavy losses, by June 11th, the Allies had secured all 5 beachheads and established a foothold in Normandy. Over the next several weeks, the Allies poured more than 325,000 troops, along with tanks, vehicles, and supplies, into Normandy, launching a steady advance across the region. The fierce fighting culminated in the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, marking a critical turning point in the war as the Allies began their final push into Germany. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is considered the largest naval battle in history and a key victory for the Allies in the Pacific theater. The battle occurred as Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, invaded the Philippines to liberate the archipelago from Japanese occupation. Japan launched a massive counterattack, deploying nearly all its remaining naval forces in an attempt to halt the invasion and prevent the Allies from gaining control of Southeast Asia. The battle involved a series of engagements spread across the Philippine Sea, with intense fighting between surface ships, submarines, and aircraft. In a desperate move, Japan deployed its first kamikaze pilots, suicide bombers who crashed their planes into US ships. Despite these efforts, the Allies won a decisive victory, inflicting devastating losses on the Japanese fleet, which lost 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of planes. The US Navy, while suffering significant casualties, emerged victorious and gained control of the waters around the Philippines. The battle effectively destroyed Japan's ability to wage naval warfare and helped the Allies gain dominance in the Pacific. Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was Adolf Hitler's last major offensive against the Western Allies and one of the bloodiest battles fought by American forces during World War II. In December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise attack in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to split the Allied lines and capture the strategic port of Antwerp. The assault was launched in the midst of brutal winter conditions, with snow, ice, and freezing temperatures adding to the difficulties faced by both sides. German forces achieved initial success, creating a bulge in the American lines as they pushed forward. However, the Allies quickly regrouped, and reinforcements, including General George S. Patton's Third Army, were rushed to the front. The weather cleared by Christmas, allowing Allied air power to strike back, and the Germans were eventually forced to retreat. The battle resulted in over 100,000 German casualties and around 81,000 American casualties. Despite the high losses, the Allies held their ground and resumed their advance toward Germany, paving the way for the final defeat of the Nazi regime. Battle of Iwo Jima, February 19th to March 26, 1945. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a brutal and bloody campaign fought 660 miles south of Tokyo, as US Marines sought to capture the volcanic island of Iwo Jima from the Japanese Imperial Army. The island was of great strategic importance because it provided a base from which the United States could launch bombing raids on mainland Japan and serve as an emergency landing site for B-29 bombers. The battle began on February 19, 1945, with a massive amphibious landing by the US Marines, followed by weeks of fierce fighting as the Japanese defenders, deeply entrenched in a network of underground tunnels and bunkers, resisted the American advance. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the US forces, the Japanese fought with tenacity, and the battle quickly turned into a protracted and costly fight. By the time the island was captured, 7,000 Marines had been killed and 20,000 wounded, while all but 216 of the 18,000 Japanese soldiers on the island were killed. The iconic photograph of US Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American resolve in the Pacific War. Iwo Jima later served as a critical airfield for US bombers and played a role in the eventual defeat of Japan. Battle of Berlin, April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. The Battle of Berlin was one of the final and most decisive engagements of World War II, as Soviet forces launched a massive offensive to capture the German capital. By April 1945, Germany was on the verge of collapse, with Adolf Hitler's regime crumbling under the weight of Allied advances from both the East and the West. The Soviet Red Army, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, encircled Berlin and began a relentless assault on the city. Supported by American and British airstrikes, Soviet forces fought their way through heavily fortified German defenses, capturing key locations such as the Gestapo headquarters and the Reichstag. As Soviet troops closed in on the city center, Hitler, realizing that defeat was imminent, committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, in his underground bunker. German forces surrendered shortly thereafter, bringing an end to the war in Europe. The fall of Berlin symbolized the total defeat of Nazi Germany and the end of Adolf Hitler's rule. Battle of Okinawa, April 1st to June 22nd, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa, the last major battle of World War II, was also one of the bloodiest. Fought on the Ryukyu Islands, just southwest of Japan, Okinawa was seen as the final stepping stone for the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. The US Army and Marine forces launched a massive amphibious assault on the island on April 1, 1945, with the goal of capturing it and using it as a base for airstrikes against Japan. The Japanese defenders, however, were deeply entrenched in fortified positions and launched fierce counterattacks, including kamikaze suicide missions that targeted Allied ships. The battle dragged on for nearly 3 months, with brutal fighting in difficult terrain. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender, and many chose to commit suicide rather than be captured. By the time the battle ended, over 12,000 American soldiers had been killed, along with more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. The high casualty rate at Okinawa played a role in the US decision to use atomic bombs to bring about the end of the war with Japan.